Today I will be teaching the game 1846, The Race for the Midwest. This is a game that was designed by Tom Lehmann. It originally was published by a company called Deep Thought Games, but recently it was reissued in a new edition by GMT Games, and that's the version that I'm going to be using. This is episode 5 of 5. And then there are 4 non-colored privates. There are 2 independent railroads, which I described to you, and there are 2 others. So let's talk about these in some sort of order. So the Chicago in Western Indiana costs $60, has a $10 income. When the corporation buys it in, it may place a token in this space marked C and WI, and that token is not one of the ones on its charter. Remember that I mentioned that each corporation has a certain number of tokens at the beginning of the game. If the Illinois Central were to buy in the Chicago and Western Indiana, it would be able to take another token out of the box in addition to its normal tokens and place it here on the CNWI space, thus giving it an extra token at no cost. It did have to pay the $60 to buy in the private company, but $60 is less than $80, and Chicago is a very useful location. That's the CNWI. Next one is the mail contract. The mail contract costs $80 and has no income, but it attaches to one train owned by the corporation and makes every space visited by that train worth $10 more. So if it were attached to a 2 train running here, instead of being worth 80, 50 and 30, this would be worth 80 plus $10 for each city would be worth 100. If this is attached to a slash train, it is worth $10 for every spot that the slash train visits, even the ones it doesn't count. So if it attaches to a 3-5 train and the 3-5 train visits 5 places and only scores 3, the mail contract will add $50 to the revenue of that train. The mail contract can be used on a different train in each operating round, but only one train. The other property of the mail contract is, as long as it is purchased by a corporation before phase 3, it never goes away. All of the other private companies are removed at the start of phase 3. The mail contract is not removed unless it's still owned by a player. And I will say that if you're a player who spent $80 for this private company and got no revenue out of it, and then it went away at the start of phase 3 because no corporation bought it, you probably made a mistake somewhere in the play. The final 2 examples are the independent railroads, which I referred to earlier, but I'm now explaining. And they're the Michigan Southern and the Big 4. And they run like major companies, like the corporations, but with some limitations. The first thing is they each have just 1 token, so they can't lay more tokens. They can lay track. In order to lay track, they need some money. Remember I said the Michigan Southern costs $140. The debt sort of goes to buy the train and the token. The $60 is cash that you put on top of this certificate as money to lay track with. So the Michigan Southern starts the game with $60 from the bank. You can imagine that as having been taken out of the $140 that you paid the bank for it. Or the Big 4 starts with $40 from the bank in order to use for laying track. They lay track just like anyone else. So for example, the Big 4, well, you might say, how does the Big 4 lay track? It doesn't have any track right now. The first thing it would do would be lay a track in its own home space, and that would cost 20. Could go any way. The next thing it might do would be to lay a track in Terre Haute, because it's now connected. That would cost $40, all that it has, and now it could run a route for revenue of 40. It doesn't have to do that, but if it were to do something like this, it wouldn't have a route, so it would run for no revenue, and that might be a bad idea in most cases, maybe not, depending on your plan. So the Big 4 has $40 to spend on laying track. Once the company runs, whatever revenue it has, it doesn't have a stock price, it has only one owner. It takes half of its revenue and pays it to the owner, and the other half of the revenue and puts it back in treasury. So imagine that we had the Big 4 here. It started with $40, it paid that $40 to lay these 2 tiles, and it earned $40. Then $20 would go to the Big 4 owner, and $20 would go back into the Big Four treasury, which would give it money to lay one more track in a future operating round. So these things run either until phase 3 happens, in which case they go away, or until they're bought in by a corporation. A corporation that buys one of these ins gets a number of things. The first thing it gets is it gets to replace the token with a token of the corporation. And it's not one of the tokens from the corporation's MAT, just like the CNWI token. It's a separate token. Each corporation has extra tokens in the GMT version to be used for this purpose, buying in the CWI or the independent railroads. Second thing that you would get is you would get any cash that's still in the independent railroad's treasury would go to the purchasing corporation's treasury. Third thing you would get is you would get this 2-train. Since the independent railroad was bought by the corporation, this 2-train would go to the corporation. However, the 2-train could not be run in the turn in which it's bought in. So you might think that you could run a route with a corporation by not running the 2-train and buying it in, but that's against the rules. You may never run the 2-train for the independent railroad in a turn in which the corporation bought it in. So it would be there, but it would be sort of on hold until the next operating round. Finally, I need to say, what can you buy an independent corporation for? And the answer is it's this non-debt amount. So remember that a private company can be bought in from anything from 1 to the value. In this case, the value is the first number. So if you buy the Big Four in, you can spend from $1 to $40 for it. Your corporation can pay the player. The Michigan Southern, you can spend $1 to $60. You may say, that's a little bit of a disadvantage. I paid $140 for it, but I only got $60 back out of the corporation. So I'm down $80. That's true, but the corporation is up a train and a token. You have to work things so that you being down and your corporation being up is to your benefit and not to your detriment. So those are the private company abilities. Again, you can buy them in at any time when the corporation is running, from the very beginning of the game if you want. Now I'm going to talk about the corporation's powers. 4 of the corporations have token laying powers. And you will see, I'm going to clear some of the space off the board, you'll see some shadow pictures of tokens. The Erie, the Pennsylvania, the Baltimore and Ohio, and the Illinois Central, don't worry about it, have token laying powers. The Illinois Central has the power to lay a token in Centralia for only $40. If you look at the charter, you'll see it says $80, $40 Centralia. So since Centralia might be a spot you want a token in to run multiple routes early, you can do that more cheaply. The Erie has the same power, but to lay a token in Erie. These 2 railroads must be connected to the spots that they're laying a token in to use those $40 powers. Also, all of these token spots are reserved for these companies. No other company can place a token so as to block out these companies until phase 4. Once phase 4 happens, if you haven't used that spot, it's too late. But a company could place a token here in this Centralia spot, but cannot place a token here. No company can place a token in Cincinnati. Let's say Cincinnati looks like this. Even though you can't see it, it still has the B&O reserve spot there. However, imagine that you upgrade Cincinnati to this. You could place a token here because you're still leaving a reserve spot for the B&O. That's the Erie, the Illinois Central reserve spots. The Pennsylvania and the B&O also have reserve spots, but those reserve spots are a little bit more flexible. So the Pennsylvania has a reserve spot in Fort Wayne, and if the Pennsylvania has a connection from one of its stations to Fort Wayne, it can place a token here for $40. However, the Pennsylvania Railroad can also place a station in Fort Wayne without having a connection with it. In fact, you might decide at the beginning of the game that Homewood is not a real exciting spot. You might begin your first operating rounds building and token laying spots action by just placing a token here in Fort Wayne, and it says here it costs $60. And then you could lay 2 tiles. Maybe you might lay one like this and one like this on your way to try to connect up Chicago, which you know is going to be worthwhile. Baltimore in Ohio has the same sort of property, except its city is Cincinnati. Cincinnati is certainly a better city than Fort Wayne. Again, if B&O is connected to Cincinnati, it can play a token there for $40, but B&O can place a token in Cincinnati for $100 without having a connection. That's more than 80, but it saves you perhaps the cost of building across the mountains to get there. So those are the token laying spots. We sometimes call the Pennsylvania and B&O's powers parachute tokens because they don't have to get there the normal way by tracing a connection. They can just drop them there and start building from that spot. So those are those two companies. Two more things to observe is that the Grand Trunk Railroad, it starts here in Port Huron, but it only has 3 tokens. So whereas most of the corporations like the New York Central and the Illinois Central have 4 tokens to use, it has only 3. You certainly could increase that number if you sold it the Michigan Southern, the Big Four, or the Chicago and Western Indiana, but it has only 3. The Pennsylvania has the opposite characteristic. The Pennsylvania has 5 tokens. Again, the one in Homewood, and 4 additional ones. Again, these do not count the ones you get from the independent railroads or the CNWI. And finally, the Illinois Central, the company with the most special powers. It has the Centralia cheap token. I already mentioned that it can, because of the generosity of the citizens of Illinois, lay yellow tiles in these hexes for 0. But it has one more special power, and that is that when it starts, the state of Illinois adds extra capital. So imagine that the Illinois Central floats at $80. Floats at $80, the person who floats it needs to buy the president's certificate for $160, putting that money into the treasury. When that happens, the bank will take $80, one share's value, and add that to the treasury so that the Illinois Central has $240. And the bank doesn't even ask for a share in response for that. So you get to sell your 10 shares, plus you get the initial capital from the state of Illinois of $80. So I've explained the heart of the game, and then I've explained the special rules involving the private company draft and the powers of the private companies and the powers of the corporations. So let me put it all together. So at the beginning of the game, you're going to set up the game. You're going to get the right bank size. If you're playing with fewer than 5 players, you're going to remove some of the corporations and some of the private companies from the game. You're going to conduct the private company draft. I need to emphasize you're going to remove some trains from the game with fewer than 5 players. And then the person with a priority deal is going to begin the stock round. And you will play the stock round with players either buying or passing or possibly selling, remembering that only the president can sell before a company operates, until all 4 of those players pass. At the end of that stock round, the priority deal is going to move. This player, in my example, received this priority deal marker card at random. It doesn't stay with that player the entire game. Instead, when a stock round is done, because there were 4 passes, there's some player who took the last action of buying and selling. And the priority deal will move to the player to that player's left. So if we imagine that the player here on my left was the last player to buy or sell, the priority deal would move to this player for the next stock round. Remember, priority deal isn't meaningful in an operating round, only in a stock round. There's one special case, which is it's possible, not likely, but it's possible that in a stock round, all the players will pass. Nobody will buy anything. No one will sell anything. If that happens, the priority deal stays where it is. Once that's finished, you do float ups for companies that are 100% owned. The price goes up. You do float downs for companies that have shares in the stock market. And then you start conducting the operating rounds. Remember, in the very first operating round of the game, it goes from low price to high price, ascending stock market order. The second operating round and every operating round after that in the game, it goes from high to low. You always do a stock round in which the players take turns, followed by 2 operating rounds in which the companies take turns. And the game ends when either everyone goes bankrupt except one, that's unlikely to happen, or when the bank runs out of money. You add the extra money in so you can finish. You do the remainder of the operating rounds. At the end of the second operating round, once the bank is broken, the game is over, and you see who's the wealthiest and who wins. My name's Eric Brosius. I'm a board gamer in the Boston area. I first became interested in board games when I was 6 years old. The neighbor company had bought a game from the Avalon Hill Company. It was about the invasion of D-Day. When they got it home, they did not understand it. And so they decided to give it to that neighbor kid next door. And I got it. And it was full of numbers, and I couldn't understand it. But it was fascinating to me. Sometimes something we don't understand is more fascinating than something we do understand. So I worked at it and practiced my reading and my math until I knew how to play that game. And that got me started in the board gaming hobby. So I've been a board gamer for over 50 years now. And that company had a catalog, and having seen the one game, I looked at other games in the catalog and got some as Christmas presents or birthday presents, and started playing. But many of my friends in the neighborhood weren't so interested in those games. They were a little complicated. But when I got to high school, I found other people that were interested in those games. So we played some more games from the Avalon Hill Company, but we played other games. I think we played games from the 3M Company, and I remember playing Diplomacy. And that was fun, but I went away to college. I didn't have much time for gaming, and eventually graduated and got married, and we moved to Boston. And I was fortunate enough to find some friends in Boston who also were interested in board games, although they didn't always play the same board games that I had played. I had played more games from some companies, and they played games from other companies. But I started to get together with them maybe a couple times a year to play board games, and found some of their board games very interesting. And I remember seeing on some internet site, long before Board Game Geek existed, that there was this new game called Settlers of Catan that was taking the world by storm. And I took the subway, I think, over to Games People Play, a store in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she had copies of Settlers of Catan, and I bought a copy. And I brought it home, and I played it with my wife and friends, and this was the best game ever. So that was another big event in my life. I still love Settlers of Catan. But as my kids grew older, we would play that game with the kids. I played many games. At one point, my son was too small to hold a hand of cards, so we would play with all of our commodity cards face up on the table to make it fair. And obviously, as they grew older, then we were able to pick them up and play again. But that was really the start of my board gaming career. In the modern sense, I had been playing already for 20 years or more when I got involved with the people in Boston. But Settlers got me really interested to play more often than a couple times a year. So I met friends in person, I met friends online, and I was happy when Board Game Geeks showed up. I was able to get information more easily and communicate with people. But today, I play games generally at least once a week. I have a local gaming group. I go to some conventions. I play with other people that are neither people that I meet at conventions or a regular group, just offhand when things happen. Sometimes I arrange 18xx days or other days to play specific games if we want to play a game. I've been having a lot of fun with it for a long time. This is episode 5 of 5.